Hello, it's the Retro Dandy here, and this time I'm going to be reviewing the C64 Mini. Now, I've had it for a little while, and I've had the chance to fiddle around with it a bit, so I think I can offer an opinion on this teeny tiny C64. So I'll have an overview of the hardware, the games, and what I did and didn't like about it. So we'll just take a quick look at that, run through a few of the games, and do a bit of video and have me talking over it, which is the thing I do. So, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, let's start with the hardware, shall we? From an aesthetic point of view, it looks great. Now, it looks like a Commodore 64 that's been shrunk in the wash, and the joystick looks very similar to the Competition Pro. The keyboard looks great, but it isn't functional, because it would be impractical to type on this. It's so small. You would need to use chopsticks or something like that. Now, it would be nice if the keyboard did work for those times when you do need to press a key, but like I say, that would be impractical. It would bump the cost up, and you can use an external USB keyboard, and there is a way of accessing a virtual keyboard from the joystick. There are two USB ports on the right of the unit, which are where the controller ports were on the original Commodore 64. There's a micro USB port for power, and an HDMI port on the back of the device. Now, it does come with a lead, a USB lead to plug in, but it doesn't come with a plug, so you have to provide your own. There's a nice weight to the unit, which is, well, it's created by weights, because the board inside, the actual, the CPU and everything itself, is pretty small, and it would have made the device quite light. So the weights have been added to give it a bit of heft. And it's one of those things, it weighs as much as it looks, if that makes sense. You pick it up and you think, oh yeah, that's what I expected it to be. Without those weights, you just pick it up and be, oh, it feels a bit cheap. So it kind of gives it a little bit of substance in a way. The joystick looks great. It's got a few extra buttons compared to the Competition Pro, but it doesn't feature micro switches, and because of that, it feels a bit cheap. And we'll cover that later. I'll go over why that isn't great in this, but again, that was probably to keep costs down. 64 games are included, so thematically that makes sense. You got stuff from Boulder Dash to California Games to Pit Stop 2, Impossible Mission 2, but not the first one, strangely, Iridium, Paradroid, things like that. So there's a good selection here. Some stuff isn't going to be on there, some classics you would expect or you associate with the Commodore 64, like Turrican. But again, I think that's more of a licensing thing. Turrican has always been a bit of a tricky one due to licensing, as we've seen from the various Turrican collections on modern consoles. So, not everything is included, but there's, a pretty good selection to get started with. You can also use the device as an original machine, so you can switch it into like a classic mode. You can program in BASIC, and like I said earlier, you'd need to plug in a keyboard to do this, but you can code stuff as if you were using an actual Commodore 64. And you can also add your own games via USB, and there are various other methods, which I've covered one of those methods in another video, which I will link to, but you can add other stuff to it. How does it fare? Emulation is great, which you'd expect, what with the original hardware being some 40 years old. This is handled by Vice, which is the standard Commodore emulator. I was hoping to run Commodore 16 games on here too, but it's not possible, at least not without using custom firmware. The main game selection screen looks nice, and is accompanied by a jaunty SID chiptune, which can be turned off if wanted. Game cover art, screenshots, and a brief description accompany each title, and games load instantly. The output of the device is only 720p, but as these games are from the 80s, I'm not sure if 1080p would have been needed. There's only so much these graphics can be upscaled. The games themselves run well, and the extra buttons allow the player to bring up an on-screen keyboard should the odd key press be required. While the games themselves are emulated well, playing them with the provided joystick can be a chore. As previously mentioned, the joystick doesn't feature micro switches, so there's no feedback for the player. This leaves you almost fighting the controller in order to play the game. It can be overcome with practice, but it's not the most enjoyable experience. So it may be worth considering either the micro-switched version of the joystick, which is sold separately, or a USB controller of your choice, as long as it's compatible, that is. I'll provide a link to a compatibility list in the description. The C64 Mini also offers a classic mode, and that's for those who want to dip into other activities like programming in C64 Basic. Now, in most cases, you'll most likely go through the old Hello World code and never use it again. For anyone who wants to delve a little deeper, you'll most likely want the C64 Maxi for its fully functional keyboard in order to replicate the feeling of using an original machine. The two USB ports seem a little tight, both in terms of generosity and functionality. You'll need to have a controller plugged into one, and the other one will be used for a keyboard, another controller, or a USB flash drive, and that's where you may run into trouble. If you want to run your own games from a flash drive, you won't be able to play two-player games. You might also find, as I did, that your drive may not quite fit alongside the USB cable for the joystick. A third USB port on the back of the device would have been a welcome addition, again something that does appear on the C64 Maxi, which has 4 USB ports. You can add games to the carousel on the device via third-party PC software, but this can be quite involved and veers away from the advertised plug-and-play functionality of the unit. As you'll notice from my carousel, there are a few games that don't appear in the games list for the C64 Mini. I've added these using third-party software, which I cover in another video. When it was initially released, there were reports of controller lag and some latency problems. Thankfully, this appears to have been quashed due to firmware updates that have been released by retrogames themselves. Now, these can be applied via USB and are straightforward to install. With the age and selection of the games, the limitations imposed by the lack of the keyboard, and the limited USB ports, it's hard to know who the C64 Mini is aimed at. It's too niche to have the mass market appeal of Nintendo's, Sega's or Sony's mini consoles, and it lacks what the advanced C64 user may want, so I can only assume it's aimed at collectors and hobbyists like myself who are happy to mess about with custom firmwares and adding ROM images. The shortcomings of the joystick betray the games, as it doesn't give the player the feedback and precision required for these titles, which are mostly tough as nails. Is it worth your money? At around £30 to £40, it's one of the cheaper tribute consoles out there at the moment, and it will set you back far less than a Raspberry Pi and a custom case would. That is, if you're able to get your hands on a Raspberry Pi right now. If you're prepared to tinker and maybe swap out the controller, it's definitely worth a punt, and it will look nice in your collection, but really it's geared more towards those who were there the first time around. If you just like playing games and expect to recapture the halcyon days of cheap games and great music, you may feel a little shortchanged. There's fun to be found here, sure, but you may need to provide it yourself. Overall, I think I would give this a 6 out of 10. Okay, so there we go. So hopefully that helped you if you were on the fence about the C64 Mini. If you've seen it cheap, it is sort of, like I say, about £30 to £40 at the moment. So hopefully I've helped with your decision making on that one. If you don't want to miss any videos, please subscribe. If you enjoyed the review, please like it. Yes, I'm not beneath asking for subscribes, likes and bell ringing on YouTube, so please feel free if you like the stuff I make. Apologies for the camera quality. I'm using a phone which is not great for this type of thing, so yeah, until I can afford something better or borrow something to make videos, then I'm afraid that's what we'll do. I'll try to focus a bit more on screen capture in future so things look a little bit nicer, but until next time, happy gaming.